Welcome to the deep dive. We're all about getting you that deep knowledge, that aha moment, but without the usual fluff.
That's the goal. Quick, deep insights.
And today, we're really diving deep into someone complex, often controversial. Julius Evola. Now, you might have heard his name linked with certain political movements, and yeah, that's definitely shaped how people see him.
It really has.
Oh.
But those political writings, they're actually a pretty small part of his overall work, especially compared to his esoteric stuff, which makes up most of his translated work in English.
Right. And those political links, mainly from the 1930s with Italian fascism and German National Socialism, they tend to be the main lens people view him through.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive is to look beyond those labels. We want to really get into one of his core ideas, the metaphysics of war.
Okay. So unpacking his views on heroism, tradition, society, but looking at what he actually wrote.
Precisely. We're going straight to the source material to understand his ideas, his perspectives. And just to be clear, we're here to explore and convey these ideas, not to endorse any politically charged viewpoints within them.
Got it. So before we jump into the whole metaphysics of war, we probably need that context, right?
Yeah.
His involvement in the 1930s with fascism and National Socialism. Was he, fully committed? Or was there more to it?
That's the key question. The sources suggest he wasn't some starry-eyed, fanatical revolutionary. It wasn't like that.
Okay.
He apparently saw these movements more as potential vehicles for maybe restoring something like a traditional society.
Well, approximating traditional society. So not the real deal, in his eyes.
Seems like it. He actually said, and this is a direct quote, "To the extent to which fascism embraces and defends traditional ideals, we shall call ourselves fascists." And this is all.
Wow, okay, that's very conditional.
It shows his engagement was quite pragmatic, His real goal wasn't just aligning with a party.
So what was the goal then? These ideals he mentioned that transcended the political sphere.
Well, his aim, as he put it, was to defend ideals unaffected by any political regime, be it fascist, communist, anarchist, or democratic.
Okay.
These ideals, for him, were above politics. But when you did apply them politically, they inevitably led to, qualitative differences, meaning hierarchy, authority, and what he called imperium, which wasn't just about empire in our modern sense, but more like a spiritual political authority based on a higher order.
Right, as opposed to
all forms of democratic and egalitarian turmoil, as he termed it. He saw fascism and Nazism, despite their flaws, as at least trying to bring back some kind of traditional hierarchy, unlike democracies or communism.
So he hoped they could be like a gateway back to older values.
Yeah, a gateway to reestablishing what he saw as genuinely traditional values in Europe, but he wasn't naive about them. His true ideal was always something like the Roman Empire. He felt the fascist and Nazi attempts to invoke ancient pasts were often extremely superficial.
Ah, okay, so just cosmetic changes, not the deep, fundamental shift he was looking for.
Exactly, which brings us neatly to his core idea here, the metaphysics of war. What is that exactly, and why focus on the individual?
Yeah, what's the concept?
Well, the big idea isn't just that war is more than physical fighting. For Evola, it's fundamentally a catalyst for interchange.
Interchange. How?
He saw it almost like a spiritual forge, something that strips away the everyday, the mundane, to reveal something deeper, something heroic within. He wrote that war offers man the opportunity to awaken the hero who sleeps within him.
The hero within.
Yeah. It breaks the routine, confronts you with mortality, and offers, in his words, a transfiguring knowledge of life according to death.
That is quite a statement, especially when you think about how he contrasted it with pacifist materialism. What's the core difference there?
He argued that what he called pacifist materialism only focuses on the negatives, the death, the suffering, the loss. It completely misses, in his view, any potential spiritual value.
And that spiritual value is?
It's about realizing the relativity of human life, understanding that there's a law of a more than life. So this deep dive isn't about saying war is good, obviously. It's about understanding Evola's really provocative idea that confronting these ultimate limits can actually spark a kind of higher vitality, pushing you beyond just comfort towards this more than life.
Okay. So the focus is squarely on the spiritual aspect, as he saw it.
Precisely, the spiritual dimension of conflict.
So if war is this intense individual spiritual path for Evola, How did he see that playing out in society? Where does this transformed warrior fit into his ideal social structure?
Right. Well, he talked about a true hierarchy in traditional civilizations. At the top, there's a spiritual elite.
The spiritual elite. Okay.
And then the inferior ways of life. He listed slaves, the bourgeois, calling their existence vegetative life, and even warriors, whose will he described as potentially uncontrolled animal will. All these lower levels, they derive their meaning from that higher spiritual principle. They're subordinate to it.
That's a very structured view.
Yeah.
And you mentioned an involutionary process earlier. Can you unpack that? How did he see society declining?
Yeah, the involutionary process, basically he saw Western history not as progress, but as a decline, a spiritual fall away from an ideal origin.
A fall from what to what?
He traced it from what he called aristocratic or sacred states, down through hierarchical warrior states, then further down into capitalist or bourgeois states.
Okay.
And finally hitting bottom with socialist, collectivist, and proletarian forms. His prime example was Russian Bolshevism, which he literally equated with the caste of the slaves, a complete inversion of the ideal hierarchy.
Wow. So given that bleak picture, where did fascism fit in for him? Was it part of the decline or something else?
He actually saw fascism as potentially a reconstructive revolution.
Reconstructive? How?
Because, in his interpretation, it affirmed an aristocratic and spiritual concept of the nation, pushing back against both collectivism and democracy. He saw its first positive step as putting the values of the merchants and slaves back under the values of the warriors, the next caste up.
So restoring part of the hierarchy.
Kind of, but that wasn't the end game for him. The really crucial next step he hoped for was the spiritualization of the warrior principle itself, moving beyond just fighting ability to a higher spiritual awareness within that warrior caste.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And this connects to that phrase he used, vita est militia super terram. Life is warfare on earth.
Exactly. It connects directly. He meant you should see your life, your existence, as having been sent in the guise of a man on a mission of military service to a remote front.
Like being a soldier on duty, always.
Pretty much. And your inner nobility, your worth, is measured by your ability resisting of accomplishing, in spite of all, what must be accomplished.
That sounds demanding, but also empowering.
It leads to, he thought, an affirmative attitude with respect to the world and a certain freedom. The world isn't just a veil of tears you passively endure. It's an arena for action, for proving yourself.
So what does that do socially, if everyone sees life as this mission?
Well, he believed it fostered a specific kind of solidarity, a new sense of social and political solidarity based on male comradeship, on fidelity and sincerity with the ethic of honor.
An ethic of honor, but not universal brotherhood.
Definitely not. He was quite explicit. Men are not our brothers, and our neighbor is in no way an insolent concept. He completely rejected those kinds of egalitarian ideas. It's much more like Roman Stoicism.
Unlike Seneca.
Yes, exactly. Seneca argued the true man is superior to a god because gods are immune to misfortune, but a man can face and challenge it. You should be proud of tough assignments, like a general picking his best soldiers for the hardest missions.
Okay. Now, a key part of Evola's argument, as I understand it, is that this metaphysics of war isn't his invention. He claimed it's universal, found across ancient traditions.
That's right. He tried to show the objective value of a principle by means of the demonstration of its universality. So he looked everywhere for echoes of this idea.
Let's start with Rome, then. You mentioned his idealization of it. How did they see war?
Well, ancient Romans were, according to the source, highly religious, and this religiosity soaked into everything, very much including the warrior experience.
In all ways.
Take the Facial, a college of priests. They handled all the specific rituals for war, from declaring it to ending it. Romans wouldn't even go into battle without favorable mystical signs.
So things like augury, reading bird signs and such.
Yes, but he argued their augural art wasn't just superstition. He saw it as a kind of knowledge of points of juncture with invisible influences, moments where human action could align with or tap into a higher plane.
Interesting. And the famous Roman triumph.
He described that as far more religious than militaristic. The victorious general wore the symbols of Jupiter, the supreme god, and laid his laurels at Jupiter's statue, essentially saying Jupiter was the real winner.
Wow. And what about that devotio ritual? That sounds intense.
It was. Leaders, like Consul Decius Mus and apparently his descendants too, could perform a ritual self-sacrifice on the battlefield. The idea was to unleash underworld forces to guarantee victory and throw the enemy into panic, making them seem no longer human.
Okay, that's a powerful connection between war, religion, and sacrifice. What about northern traditions, Celtic, Nordic, Aryan?
Similar themes emerge. The ancient Celtic saying was basically, fight for your land and accept death if need be, since death is a victory and a liberation to the soul.
And the Nordic idea of Valhalla.
Right, Valhalla. The seat of celestial immortality, but it was specifically reserved for the free, the divine lineage, and especially for heroes killed in battle. Odin, or Wotan, showed them the way there.
So dying in battle was the highest honor.
According to this view, yes. No sacrifice was more appreciated by the supreme god than that which is performed by the warrior who fights and falls on the battlefield. And it wasn't just about personal reward. The spirits of these fallen heroes were believed to add their forces to the gods, fighting against chaos in the Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods.
And figures like Valkyries.
Yes, the Valkyries in the Nordic sagas, and similar figures called Fravashi in the Iranian-Persian tradition, he describes them as transcendental personification of parts of the warriors themselves, like women of light and stormy virgins of battle, embodying supernatural power leading to these overwhelming victories. And you also have figures like Mithra, the Persian warrior who never sleeps, representing constant struggle.
Okay, so we see these threads in pagan Europe and Persia. Then Evola makes a perhaps surprising connection to the Islamic tradition. How did he see jihad fitting into this?
It might seem like an opposite pole, but he argued it actually reflected some of these ancient Aryan Iranian concepts. He focused on that famous saying attributed to the Prophet Muhammad after a battle.
Which one?
I return now from the lesser to the greater war.
The lesser and greater jihad.
Exactly. The lesser war is the external one, the physical, bloody battle against external enemies. And significantly, Evola points out the enemies often have characteristics resembling the negative aspects the warrior is trying to purge within himself.
And the greater war.
That's the internal struggle. The interior and intangible order it is the war which is fought against the enemy, whom everyone bears in himself. It's fundamentally ascetic, a battle against the lower self.
Now, this is important. The source itself notes that this dual understanding isn't always emphasized today, right?
Yes, it explicitly says, regrettably, this dual concept of jihad has been rejected by today's Islamist radicals who believe that the war against the infidels should take precedence.
But the dual concept still exists somewhere.
The source states it's still to be found among the Islamic mystics, the Sufis. It also mentions that even acts of self-sacrifice, like those of suicide bombers, while obviously viewed differently today, can be seen in Evola's framework as retaining an echo of that traditional idea of self-sacrifice and yearning for transcendence, similar maybe to Japanese kamikaze pilots or the medieval Ismaili assassins.
So the lesser war serves the greater war.
That's the traditional idea he's highlighting. The lesser war is an instrument in the realization of the greater or holy war. In this view, jihad and the path of God become synonymous.
Okay. And finally, he looked at the Hindu-Aryan traditions, specifically the Bhagavad Gita. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. The Gita is essentially a dialogue between the warrior prince Arjuna, who represents action, and the god Krishna, his charioteer and spiritual guide, representing transcendent knowledge. Evola saw their conversation as almost an internal process for Arjuna, a sort of monologue developing a progressive inner clarification.
And what happens in this dialogue? Arjuna hesitates to fight his own relatives, right?
He does. He feels pity. But Krishna tells him this pity is like impurities, something not at all befitting a man who knows the value of life. He says it leads not to higher planets, but to infamy.
Strong words. What's the alternative Krishna offers?
A very clear promise. Either you will be killed on the battlefield and attain the heavenly planets, or you will conquer and enjoy the earthly kingdom. Therefore, get up with determination and fight.
So duty over personal feeling. But there's an inner dimension, too.
Absolutely. Krishna stresses the inner war. He says, one should steady the mind by deliberate spiritual intelligence and thus by spiritual strength conquer this insatiable enemy known as lust. The real enemy within is passion, that animal thirst for life.
So how should Arjuna fight?
Krishna's instruction is key to Evola's interpretation. Do thou fight for the sake of fighting without considering happiness or distress, loss or gain, victory or defeat, and by so doing you shall never incur sin.
Fight for the sake of fighting. Detached action.
Exactly. For Evola, the only real sin here is an incomplete will, holding back. The ideal warrior acts not with human strength alone, but channels a divine force. The soul is eternal, indestructible. The body is just temporary, illusory.
That famous line, the self slays not, nor is slain.
That's the one. It encapsulates the idea of transcending the physical self. Evola loved the Gita's imagery, life like a bow, the mind like the arrow, the target to pierce the supreme spirit, to join mind to spirit as the shot arrow hits its target.
Wow.
For him, the supreme heroic path makes that idea of war as the path of God literally true. The hero becomes a kind of divine manifestation.
Okay, we've traced this idea through history and tradition. Now we have to get into one of Evola's most difficult and controversial areas, his concept of race. It wasn't just biological for him, was it?
No, not at all. It's complex. He spoke of race as having components of body, yes, but also soul and spirit. He envisioned it as a deep metabiological force.
Metabiological, like an underlying essence.
Something like that. Almost a spiritual energy unique to a people. He even drew an analogy between racial decline and individual collapse. A loss of all moral tension and the attitude of passive abandonment ultimately leading to physical collapse for a race, just like for a person.
And he saw racism, his version of it, as having two jobs.
Yes. First, passive defense, basically, protecting the race from external influences like mixing, crossbreeding. And second, active resistance.
Active resistance.
Which meant to awaken its inner race, to maintain this intimate tension, this uncontrollable and irreducible fire within the group. And war for him was the ultimate total test for these surviving racial forces.
That's intense. He even suggested catastrophes could be necessary.
He did. He wrote that nameless catastrophes could even be the hard but necessary price of heroic peaks and new liberations of primordial forces. A very stark view.
So connecting this to heroism, he didn't just praise any act of bravery, did he? He was critical of vague heroism.
Right. He pointed out that from a purely material point of view, you could put the savage, the gangster, and the crusading knight all on the same level. That wasn't good enough for him.
He talked about races of nature.
Yeah, which he saw as purely biological, instinctive groups, often just a degenerate remnant of vanished, far superior races. He felt modern people had often lost both the grounding of these nature races and the potential of what he called the super race.
And the race of the bourgeois. He wasn't a fan.
Not at all. He described them as the petty conformist and right-thinking man, basically half-extinguished material, a clear sign of racial degeneration in his view.
And this critique extended to how war was portrayed, like with Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front.
Yes. He acknowledged Remarque depicted a real negative outcome of war, the brutal reality. But he argued Remarque reduced the whole war to a single, certainly real, but particular aspect of it.
What aspect was missing for Evola?
The potential for war to be a catharsis, a purification, ignis purgentiae, a purging fire. He felt Remarque only understood the first solution. Basic survival, the preservation of the biological, the bodily race.
And how did that compare to someone like René Quinton?
Quinton, in his Maxims on War, defined heroism in purely biological terms, driven by instincts of the species, even sexual selection. War is a chapter of love, Quinton wrote, and hatred is the most important thing in life. Evola saw this as entirely subpersonal heroism, focused only on the physical race of the body.
Okay, so if that's the subpersonal, what was the ideal? The super race or Olympian heroism?
This is where it gets really distinct. Olympian heroism is where intense life, the biological element, is almost transformed into something more than life. The suprabiological element.
Suprabiological meaning?
It involves a freeing upwards from the confines of individuality. It's like the deeper self bursts through, becoming an instrument of a sort of active ecstasy.
Active ecstasy, that sounds almost mystical.
It has that quality. This state, he believed, transforms the person, leading to lucid vision, precise action, command, and domination. Even death changes meaning.
How so?
Death becomes, in this respect, a testimony to life. He connected it back to the Roman idea of mors triumphalis, triumphant death, and the Nordic Valhalla.
And he saw ancient wars embodying this.
Yes, he believed ancient traditions often saw wars as earthly reflections of a cosmic struggle, images of a perennial struggle between metaphysical forces. On one side, the Olympian and luminous principle, order, spirit, light. On the other, raw force, the titanic telluric element, which he associated with the demonic feminine principle of chaos.
And the Aryan race.
In his view, the true Aryan race saw itself as the army of the Olympian principle in this ongoing cosmic war.
Which brings us to the modern world. How did Evola view heroism, or the lack of it, in his own time, especially in democracies.
He was scathing, frankly. He saw immense hypocrisy. Modern democracies, he argued, march people into war in the name of the war against war.
A contradiction.
Absolutely. They demand heroes while proclaiming pacifism as the highest ideal, and they strip combat of deeper meaning, reducing it to just having to defend oneself as a last resort.
What's the ideal being defended then, according to him?
The bourgeois ideal. Fighting merely for the carefully maintained security of existence, for the maximum comfort of the human animal. People end up fighting just for their own skin, as the writer Curzio Malaparte put it, and Evola added, it's fighting not for honor or justice, but for this disgusting skin.
So the vision modernity offers is...
He summed it up pretty bleakly. Babbitt, bourgeois safety, the whole civilization of the domesticated and standardized human animal, which eats and copulates, and the limits of whose horizon is Reader's Digest, Hollywood, and the Sprite Stadium.
Ouch. But despite his critique of modern militarism, the source says he thought conflict was likely inevitable, that forces were already in motion.
Yes. This leads to that Hindu expression he liked, to ride the tiger.
Meaning you can't avoid the danger, so you have to confront it head on.
Exactly. You have to mount the destructive force itself. He referenced the writer Ernst Jünger here. Jünger argued that modern man created technology, but now that technology turns against him, reduces him to its own instrument and threatens him with destruction.
And war is the ultimate expression of this.
For Evola, yes, especially modern war. Total, elemental war, the merciless struggle with materiality itself, technology unleashed.
So if this tide is coming, what's the only option for humanity? In Evola's view, what's the final heroic stance?
His conclusion is stark. Man, the only real choice is to confront this force, to render himself fit to answer this challenge. It means finding hitherto unsuspected spiritual dimensions within himself.
Awakening something dormant.
Yes, awakening forms of extreme, essentialized heroism. Forms that don't care about the individual person, but actualize what Jünger called the absolute person within. And somehow, that intense, self-transcending experience is what could justify the whole destructive process.
Well, this deep dive into Evola's Metaphysics of War has certainly given us a lot to think about. It's a challenging perspective, to say the least.
Definitely.
So to recap, Evola, drawing on all these ancient traditions, saw war not just as physical conflict, but as this intense spiritual crucible, an opportunity for inner transformation, for awakening a kind of superpersonal heroism that transcends the merely biological or materialistic.
And the source leaves us with this rather chilling thought. Nameless catastrophes could even be the hard but necessary price of heroic peaks and new liberations of primordial forces dulled through gray centuries. But such is the fatal condition for the creation of any new world, and it is a new world that we seek for the future.
A powerful and maybe unsettling idea to end on. So for you listening, even outside the context of literal war, how might this concept of vita est militia superterram life as warfare apply? What are the inner wars you face? And drawing from Evola's ideas, how might one cultivate that Olympian detachment, that inner strength when facing modern challenges and what he saw as the materialistic degeneration of action? Lots to ponder there.